My own mother took the stand against me in court, trying to force me to pay child support for a baby that wasn't mine. Her argument? DNA didn't matter. Family was family. But months later, when I finally exposed the sickening truth about my ex-wife, my mother was furious. The entire family started pulling away from her, and now, even my father is considering divorce. Let me start by explaining something crucial. My mother had always longed for a daughter. It wasn't just a passing wish. It was a deep-seated dream she carried for as long as I can remember. When she and my father found out they were expecting their first child, me, her excitement was through the roof. But the moment she learned I was a boy, everything changed. She was devastated, and she never hid that disappointment. In fact, she reminded me of it constantly throughout my life, making it clear that she had hoped for a different outcome. My parents had planned on having more children, mostly because my mother was so determined to have a daughter. But life had other plans. After giving birth to me, my mother developed serious health complications, and over time, it became impossible for her to carry another child. The realization that she would never have a daughter crushed her. I can only imagine how painful that must have been for her, and I don't think she ever truly got over it. As the years went by, my mother's longing for a daughter only grew stronger. She showered my female cousins with affection, gifts, and attention, more than she ever gave me. It was as if she was trying to fill the void left by the daughter she never had. Whether it was through extra presents, special treatment, or just the way she looked at them, the difference in how she treated them compared to me was obvious. Oddly enough, for most of my life, I didn't let it bother me. I had accepted that this was just how my mother was. I never doubted that she loved me, and I made peace with the fact that she simply wished things had been different. That all changed when Sophia entered the picture. Sophia was the daughter of my mother's long-lost best friend from high school. After reconnecting with her old friend, my mother met Sophia and was immediately captivated by her beauty. From that moment on, she became obsessed with the idea that Sophia was the perfect woman for me. At the time, I was single, and my mother had been on a relentless mission to set me up with different women. None of her matchmaking attempts had ever amounted to anything, but this time, she wouldn't let it go. She constantly gushed about how gorgeous and amazing Sophia was, how we would be a perfect match, and how I had to meet her. It was almost like a fixation. For weeks, I endured her persistent efforts to push us together. Eventually, I gave in, not because I was particularly interested, but because I wanted my mother to stop talking about Sophia. I figured one blind date would get her off my back. When I finally met Sophia, she was exactly as my mother had described, stunningly beautiful. But as the night went on, I realized there wasn't much beyond that. Beneath her looks, there was little substance. One of the first things I try to learn about someone is what drives them, their goals, their dreams, and what they envision for their future. So naturally, when I asked Sophia about her aspirations, I was caught off guard by her response. Without hesitation, she told me her ultimate dream was to be a stay-at-home mom. That answer immediately gave me pause. It wasn't that I looked down on the idea of raising a family. It's an admirable role, but at that stage of my life, I had completely different priorities. Having kids wasn't even on my radar yet, and I had always imagined being with someone who had ambitions that extended beyond just starting a family. Curious, I asked her what she planned to do in the meantime, before having children. Her answer only left me more baffled. She simply shrugged and said she wanted to be a stay-at-home wife. I stared at her, confused, as she went on to explain that her mother had never worked a day in her life. Her father had always provided for the family until he passed away. To her, that was the key to a happy and successful marriage. While I could respect that it worked for her parents, it was completely at odds with what I wanted in a partner. I had always been drawn to people who had a passion for something, whether it was a career, a creative pursuit, or a personal goal. The idea of someone choosing to be a stay-at-home spouse from the outset just didn't align with my values. At the time, Sophia and her mother were living with her uncle, who covered all their expenses because her mother still had no interest in working. That detail only reinforced my growing concern that Sophia had no real desire to build a life for herself. When I left that first date, I felt let down, though I hadn't even had high hopes going into it. I had agreed to meet her mostly to get my mother off my back, but by the end of the evening, I knew without a doubt that she wasn't what I was looking for. Predictably, my mother didn't take the news well. She was visibly upset when I told her how I felt, as if I had personally insulted her by not wanting to pursue Sophia. She insisted I hadn't given her a fair chance, telling me over and over that if I just put in more effort, I'd see what she saw. But my mind was made up. I told her, as gently but firmly as I could, to let it go. I should have known that wouldn't be the end of it. My mother was never one to back down when she wanted something. Not long after, she invited me over for dinner, something she often did, so I didn't think much of it. But when I arrived, I immediately noticed that Sophia was there too. It didn't take long to figure out what was happening. My mother had orchestrated another chance encounter, practically setting us up on an unplanned date. Before I could say anything, both my mother and father hurried out the door with amused smiles, throwing a casual "enjoy your date" over their shoulders. I was mortified. Judging by the look on Sophia's face, she felt just as ambushed as I did. For a moment, we just stood there in awkward silence, neither of us knowing what to say. It was like being forced into a date neither of us had agreed to. Except this one was happening in the middle of my parents' living room, with no easy way out. I could have made up an excuse and left, but I didn't want to embarrass Sophia further. After all, she was just as much a victim of my mother's overzealous matchmaking as I was. Instead, we exchanged a few awkward laughs, acknowledging how ridiculous the situation was, and eventually sat down to talk. Since we were already stuck in this situation with nothing better to do, I figured I might as well take the opportunity to learn more about Sophia. So, I asked her to tell me about herself. She was surprisingly open, admitting that she had genuinely liked me after our first date and had assumed I felt the same way. But when I never reached out or followed up, she had been left confused and unsure of where she stood. I tried to be as kind as possible when explaining my perspective. I told her that while she was undoubtedly a beautiful and kind person, I felt that we had very different life goals, especially since she wanted to be a stay-at-home wife. However, she quickly clarified that her vision for her life didn't mean she just planned to sit at home all day doing nothing, even if we didn't have kids right away. She opened up about her volunteer work at the church, describing how she spent her days helping children and assisting those in need. Hearing this gave me a new perspective. I started to see another side of Sophia, one that I hadn't fully appreciated before. At her core, she seemed to be a genuinely warm and selfless person. Or at least, that's how she presented herself to me at the time. Although she wasn't career-driven or motivated by big personal ambitions, she had found purpose in caring for others, and that kind of generosity was rare. So despite my initial doubts about our compatibility, I decided to take a leap of faith and ask her out on another date. Sophia and I ended up dating for about a year before we decided to take the next step and get engaged. Around that time, I had also received a promotion at work, which significantly increased my income and gave me a sense of financial security. I felt comfortable enough to support Sophia once we got married, which gave me the confidence to propose. However, the timing of the proposal wasn't entirely my decision. Both of our mothers, especially mine, had been subtly pushing for us to get married sooner rather than later. They constantly reminded us about Sophia's biological clock, even though neither of us was in a rush to start a family. But their persistence made it feel like marriage was the inevitable next step. Once we were engaged, my mother wasted no time taking charge of the wedding planning. She insisted on throwing a grand, extravagant ceremony, sparing no expense, and even offered to cover the entire cost herself. It was as if she was planning the wedding of the daughter she never had. It was an incredibly generous gesture, but also a bit overwhelming. From the venue to the decorations to the guest list, my mother micromanaged every detail. The ceremony ended up being far more lavish than I had anticipated, but seeing how happy Sophia was made it all worth it. After the wedding and honeymoon, I quickly settled back into my demanding job, which had only become more intense since my promotion. Meanwhile, Sophia moved into my place and, as we had discussed before, fully embraced her role as a stay-at-home wife. But she wasn't idle. True to her word, she continued her volunteer work at a local church, something she had always been passionate about. However, it wasn't long before I started noticing little things about her routine that seemed off. Since we had never lived together before, I was learning all these small details about her daily habits that I hadn't picked up on while we were dating. One thing that really stood out was how often she insisted that I send money to her mother every month. Her reasoning? We had more than enough, and as a good son-in-law, it was my responsibility to help support her mom. I found the whole situation strange, especially since this financial expectation had never come up before our marriage. I had always assumed that her uncle took care of her mother's expenses, but now, out of nowhere, I was suddenly expected to contribute. That wasn't the only thing that seemed off. Sophia was rarely home. I had assumed that, as a stay-at-home wife, she would spend more time taking care of the household, handling things like cooking, cleaning, and keeping our home in order while I was at work. Instead, she was constantly out, often returning home late in the evening. What puzzled me even more was how rushed she always seemed when I got home. She would frantically start cooking dinner at the last minute as if she hadn't thought about it all day. When I asked why she was out so late, she always had a story. She was helping a homeless person, mentoring a child from the community, or assisting someone in need. I didn't want to discourage her from doing what she believed was meaningful, but at the same time, I had expected a balance. As a homemaker, I thought she would take on certain responsibilities at home. That wasn't happening. Dinner was always late and thrown together at the last minute. The laundry was never done on time, and the house was rarely cleaned to any reasonable standard. At first, I let it slide, not wanting to make a big deal out of it. But as time went on, I found myself growing frustrated. I tried to address it calmly, having multiple conversations about how she could better manage her time between her volunteer work and her responsibilities at home. Every time, she promised she would improve. Every time, nothing changed. The pattern repeated itself: late dinners, undone chores, and endless excuses about how busy she had been helping others. Then, one weekend, I decided to surprise her. Since she was always out volunteering, I figured I'd stop by the church she claimed to spend so much time at. Maybe I could see her in action, support her, and even lend a hand. When I arrived at the church, I asked around for Sophia, expecting to find her immersed in her work. Instead, I was met with confusion. No one seemed to recognize her name. I asked several people, describing her, but the response was always the same. No one knew who she was. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach. For months, my wife had been telling me she spent her days at this very church, dedicating herself to helping others. And yet, the people who worked there, people who would have known her if she had been there regularly, had never even seen her. I tried to convince myself that maybe there had been some mistake. Maybe I had misunderstood the name of the church. Maybe she volunteered somewhere else nearby. But deep down, I already knew the truth. That evening, when Sophia came home, I acted like nothing was wrong. I casually asked her how her day had been, and she launched into her usual story, going on and on about all the people she had helped and the work she had done at the church. Once she was done talking, I asked her directly, "Which church did you go to today?" Without hesitation, she repeated the name of the very same church I had visited earlier, the one where no one knew her. That's when I knew this wasn't just a misunderstanding. Sophia had been lying to me. Over and over again. She had been deliberately deceiving me, and I couldn't understand why. What was she really doing all day? Why was she lying to me over and over again? Something wasn't right, and I was determined to get to the bottom of it. The next morning, instead of heading to work like usual, I parked my car a short distance away from our house, far enough to stay hidden but close enough to keep an eye on Sophia. I had made up my mind. I was going to follow her and see where she really spent her days. Deep down, I wanted her to prove me wrong. I wanted to see her drive to the church just like she always claimed, to have this entire situation turn out to be a misunderstanding. I even prepared myself to confess later, to apologize for doubting her, and to admit that my insecurities had gotten the best of me. But nothing could have prepared me for what actually happened. About an hour after I left, I watched as Sophia stepped out of the house, but she looked completely different. Gone were the conservative outfits she usually wore around me. Instead, she had on a pair of shorts and a tank top, clothes I had never seen her wear before. My stomach tightened as she got into her car. I expected her to drive toward the church. Instead, she took off in the opposite direction. My heart pounded as I followed her, keeping several cars behind to avoid being noticed. I kept trying to rationalize the situation. Maybe she was running an errand. Maybe she was meeting someone from the church elsewhere. Maybe. But then she pulled into a quiet neighborhood and parked in front of a house I didn't recognize. It wasn't her mother's home, and as far as I knew, none of her cousins lived there either. Before I could make sense of it, the front door opened, and a man walked out to greet her. Then, my entire world shattered. I watched in stunned silence as he pulled her into an embrace. And then, right there in the driveway, they kissed. It wasn't a hesitant or stolen moment. It was familiar, comfortable, like something they had done 100 times before. My breath caught in my throat. My hands clenched around the steering wheel as I tried to process what I was seeing. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion. Except this time, I was the one crashing, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Sophia and the man lingered in each other's arms before turning and walking inside the house together, wrapped around each other like a couple who belonged. I felt sick. This wasn't just some one-time mistake or a spur-of-the-moment lapse in judgment. The way they interacted, the ease, the familiarity, it was obvious that this had been going on for a long time. Every excuse, every late night, every rushed dinner suddenly made perfect sense. She had been living a double life, lying to my face while carrying on an affair right under my nose. My first instinct was to call my mother. I wanted to vent, to tell her everything, to hear her voice and get some kind of reassurance. But I stopped myself. If I told her now, she would no doubt call Sophia immediately, either out of anger or shock, and that would tip her off. No, I couldn't let her know I had found out. Not yet. I needed proof. Solid, undeniable evidence of her affair, so that when the moment came to confront her, I would have everything I needed to walk away from this marriage for good. For the next 2 weeks, I focused all my energy on gathering that proof. Every move she made, every lie she told, I documented it all. And when the time was right, I would finally confront her and end this charade once and for all. During this time, I met with a lawyer to ensure that my assets would be protected as much as possible when the divorce went through. Since Sophia and I hadn't signed a prenuptial agreement, I wanted to make sure this betrayal didn't leave me financially devastated. The evening I finally confronted her felt surreal. I sat her down and calmly told her that I knew about her affair. At first, she looked stunned, then defensive. She tried to argue, to deny everything, but I had come prepared for this moment. One by one, I laid out the evidence I had gathered over the past month. Photos of her with the other man. Screenshots of their text conversations that I had retrieved from her phone. Records of all the days she had claimed to be at church when, in reality, she had been somewhere else entirely. With every new piece of proof I presented, the color drained from her face. She knew there was no way to talk her way out of this. Finally, after realizing she was completely cornered, she confessed. She admitted that the man she had been seeing was her high school boyfriend, a fact I had already confirmed after doing some research and tracking him down on Facebook. But she tried to downplay the whole thing, brushing it off as nothing serious. She claimed she had just been fooling around, insisting she never meant for things to go as far as they had. I wasn't buying a single word. I looked her in the eye and told her, with absolute certainty, that I was divorcing her. She was stunned. I think, deep down, she had convinced herself that she could manipulate the situation, that I would forgive her, or at least that I wouldn't have the resolve to actually leave. But when she realized I was serious, she panicked. She begged me to reconsider, promising that she could change, that we could work things out. But I had already made up my mind. There was no going back. The trust was gone, and without that, there was nothing left worth saving. I calmly told her to pack her things and leave. To ensure there would be no confusion or any attempt to twist the story, I created a group chat with my parents and Sophia's mother. In that chat, I laid everything out. I sent them all the proof, every photo, every message, every undeniable piece of evidence. I wanted them to know exactly why I was divorcing her, leaving no room for lies or manipulation. I knew that once the news broke, chaos would follow, and I wasn't about to let anyone rewrite the narrative. As expected, the reactions were intense. My mother was furious, outraged that Sophia had betrayed me. But despite the overwhelming evidence, she and Sophia's mother still begged me to reconsider. They pleaded with me to find it in my heart to forgive her, to give her another chance. Thankfully, my father was firmly on my side. He told me I was making the right decision, that no one should stay with a cheating spouse, no matter the circumstances. He reassured me that I deserved better and supported my choice to move forward with the divorce. Then, a week after I filed, Sophia and her mother showed up at my house unannounced. Sophia stood there, eyes filled with desperation, and dropped a bombshell. She was pregnant. My immediate reaction? Disbelief. I outright refused to accept that I was the father, given everything I had uncovered about her affair. But Sophia's mother wasted no time turning the situation around, attacking me with accusations. She lashed out, blaming me for ruining her daughter's life, saying I was cruel for refusing to take responsibility for the baby and for divorcing Sophia so suddenly. She made it seem as if I was the villain in this story. Later, my own mother doubled down on her pleas. She tried to convince me that a child changes everything, that maybe this could be a turning point for our marriage. But I wasn't falling for it. My mother tried to convince me that having a baby would somehow fix everything, that the pregnancy was a magical solution to Sophia's infidelity. She insisted that Sophia had promised never to cheat again and that I needed to think about the child's future, not just my pride. She made me feel like the bad guy for choosing to walk away from a marriage where the trust had been shattered. When I still refused to back down, my mother, in a desperate attempt to sway me, threatened to testify against me in court. She said that if the issue of child support came up, she would make sure I paid, whether or not the baby was actually mine. DNA doesn't matter. Family is family, she argued, making it painfully clear that she didn't care who the biological father was. She was determined to claim the child as her grandchild, even if it meant turning against me in court. And true to her word, that's exactly what she did. During the divorce proceedings, my mother testified against me, standing by Sophia and her mother. It was one of the most painful betrayals I had ever experienced. My lawyer and I fought hard, ensuring the court understood that Sophia had been unfaithful and that there was a very real chance the child wasn't mine. But my mother and Sophia's mother worked together to downplay everything. They swore under oath that Sophia's affair had never been physical, dismissing her infidelity as nothing more than a moment of weakness. They even argued that because Sophia and I had been intimate just weeks before I discovered her affair, the baby must be mine. Thankfully, the judge refused to make a ruling on child support or paternity without solid proof. A DNA test would have to be conducted after the baby was born before any final decision was made. It was a small victory in an otherwise painful process. At least now, I wouldn't be forced to support a child that wasn't mine based on nothing but assumptions. But my mother, Sophia, and her mother? They were furious. Later, my mother confronted me and said something that cut deeper than I expected. "I wish you weren't my son," she spat. She told me that if I were a real man, I would pull my pants up and take responsibility for Sophia's child, regardless of the paternity test results. Over the next several months, she went on a rampage, bad-mouthing me to every relative who would listen. She painted me as the villain, the man who destroyed his marriage over what she called a one-time mistake. It didn't matter how much proof I had or how logical my arguments were. She refused to accept the truth. So you can imagine the satisfaction I felt when the day finally came for the paternity test results. Sophia gave birth to a baby girl this week, and the test was done immediately. The results? The baby was not mine, just as I had suspected all along. When I shared the results with Sophia, she broke down in tears, begging me to accept the child anyway. She sobbed about how her friends and family would abandon her, how she would be left alone to raise the baby if I didn't step up. I won't lie, I felt a deep pang of sympathy for her situation. But sympathy doesn't change reality. "I'm sorry, but I can't do that," I told her firmly. "This is no longer my responsibility." Since then, Sophia has continued calling me, leaving voicemail after voicemail, pleading for me to reconsider. But the answer remains the same. So now, I have to ask, am I the jerk for refusing to claim a child that isn't mine? Update 1. For everyone asking, yes, Sophia is still trying to convince me to take responsibility for her child. Her latest argument? Since I'm probably not having kids anytime soon, I should just think of this baby as mine. As if that somehow cancels out the fact that she cheated on me. She also admitted something that didn't surprise me at all. The man she had an affair with refused to marry her. In fact, he was never ready to settle down, which is why she had to marry me in the first place. It's crystal clear now. She never loved me. She was just using me as a financial safety net while keeping her real relationship going in the background. Honestly, I hope she at least takes the real father to court for child support. But at this point, I don't care anymore. Update 2. I took everyone's advice and made a Facebook post publicly announcing that I am not the father of Sophia's child. I was done with my mom supporting Sophia after everything she did to me. She humiliated me for months. I wanted her to feel the same public shame. And guess what? It worked. After I called her out for backing Sophia, she called me, furious. Turns out, people had started turning on her, and she couldn't handle it. She accused me of betraying her, which is hilarious considering she literally testified against me in court and tried to force me to pay child support for a child that isn't mine. At first, a lot of my mom's friends and relatives had believed her version of the story. But once the paternity test results were out, everyone saw the truth. People started calling her out in the comments, and even to her face, telling her that she had failed as a parent and that I was the real victim. Then, something unexpected happened. After my mother's public humiliation, she and my dad had a massive fight. He was sick of her constantly bullying me and said he was done if she didn't drop this insane idea that I should claim Sophia's child as my own. Update 3. It's been 5 months since my last update, and things have taken a huge turn. My parents have decided to separate. Why? Because my mother refuses to change. In fact, she's gone all in on this delusional fantasy. She's calling herself grandma to Sophia's baby, giving her money every month, and even offering to babysit, as if this is the daughter she's always wanted. Meanwhile, my dad has had enough. He feels like my mom is acting in a way that's completely inappropriate and wants nothing to do with Sophia or her child. This has led to multiple fights between them, and every time, my mother refuses to take accountability. So my dad made a decision. He moved out, and he's staying with me now. It's honestly heartbreaking to see my own mother choosing my cheating ex-wife's child over her own family. But at the same time, I'm done caring. My dad is meeting with a lawyer this week. He's moving forward with the divorce. And honestly, good for him.